Hello everyone, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Compression Thinking series. My name is Ethan Berry and I'm joined by Robert Doc Hall, co-founder of the Compression Institute and professor emeritus at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business. Doc's career started in engineering and manufacturing. His experience in these fields is what paved the way for his realization that current business models are contributing to the destruction of our planet. How do we get along without leaving too much of a mess? How do we adapt to a changing environment? Well, these are some of the questions Doc has been asking his entire career. This series is about how you can help to make a difference by making nature a stakeholder in your business or community. To do this, we need to change our values. But before we can do that, we need to change the way we think. If you enjoy this series, please don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Doing so helps us spread this program to more people and more communities who may benefit from the message. Now, you may be wondering what we mean when we use the word compression. Well, in the context of this podcast, compression is a reference to the squeeze we are putting on nature. To ease the compression of nature, we need to compress the way we live. Compression thinking is a guide to help us do just this, hopefully before it's too late. So how do you become a compression thinker? Well, you'll just have to keep listening to find out. So, Doc, we're here today to talk about the third principle in your guide to compression thinking, organize to learn. So the title says it all, but in your words, what is it in particular that we're organizing to learn?
Well, if you're into compression and then compression thinking, need to learn different ways of living as well as doing, working. And so that's a lot to learn. Maybe in a hurry. When you think of learning, sometimes you just think of school learning. It's sometimes somewhat abstract learning. That's good. That'll get you somewhere, maybe. But practice is necessary. If we never wind up doing something differently, well, we had something in the head, but we never got it beyond that. And so if our goal is survival of all life, living in symbiosis with nature, that's a lot of learning and a different way to think about how you work and what you do and why. And the idea of organizing for learning is maybe you can't do all that just all by yourself. We're going to have to do things collectively as communities.
Mm-hmm. If you think about it, our individual intelligences, I'm not intelligent enough to solve the issue of plastic in the sea, and I don't know, Doc, do you think you can solve climate change on your own?
No, most of us just have trouble even contemplating it on our own. And so what do we really have to do differently? And one of the problems is that it's so different from the way most of us, particularly in the last 100 years or so, got accustomed to living. It's the system.
When we come together to learn, we're tapping into that collective intelligence, right? Many people coming together for one problem, it's just much more efficient, and the problems we're facing, like you said, they're so huge, we can't do it on our own, Doc. But I think to kind of get a grapple on this situation, we need to turn our eyes on the system, you said that's the main problem, and it is. What are some blind spots in the system? Because, most people, this is all we've ever known. Most people don't think outside of this box, right?
Yeah, I don't a good part of the time because you have to. It's the system we live by, and its most basic assumptions are expansion, not compression. And so you talk with almost anybody in business what they want to do. They want to grow the business. If the business isn't growing, it's a failure. It may not really be that way because a lot of small businesses don't grow and don't really need to, but that's kind of a mentality that comes with it. Our measurement systems are kind of directed that way. Call them me-centered measurement.
Me-centered measurements. Could you go a little further in that? What do you mean?
Well, you may be just referring to yourself, or you may be referring to my company or our company. And so that leads to a big emphasis on productivity, the impression being that the more stuff we create for each hour of labor, or day of labor, or year of labor, surely the better off we are. I don't know, question that. But if you want to talk about efficiency in business, they usually talk about productivity. Or what's how much could you sell divided by your total head count in the business? And now, first of all, that confines your thinking to the box that you call the business. And then you get to the whole area of accounting. And what is that? Well, it's a record keeping of the dollar transactions that go across the boundary. And the boundary is a transactional boundary. What dollars came in, what dollars went out. And if you take in more dollars than you sent out, well, you're keeping some and you're making a profit. And that's the idea. It's partly the idea with us as individuals and not just as some giant corporation. A C corporation legally generally has a charter that requires its board of directors to maximize profit for the ownership, the shareholder. They won't follow that exactly. Maybe the only time when they'd get legal pressure to do it is if the corporations be sold, and then if they're not selling it to the highest bidder, they got to explain to the shareholders and maybe to a court. And so that's all growth, growth-oriented. If your objective is maintaining life in perpetuity, it fuzzes that objective a great deal. What are we really doing?
There's just a certain amount of people, they're so, like I was saying earlier, take me for instance. I was born, I'm 23 years old. I was born 1996. I've known this way of living is all I've ever known, right? And if you look at people in the industry, wealthy businessmen, they kind of view the rules of the system. It's kind of dogmatic, don't you think?
Oh, this is akin to a religion, regardless of, what religion somebody might subscribe to as a matter of some formal rituals. This is the state religion, because the thinking permeates governments and government agencies. It isn't just businesses. It's the way we think.
Kind of have this reverence for the free market as if it's like a living and breathing thing, right? But it itself is a human construct, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that just, we created it, and then there's people who say, we can't regulate the market. It doesn't make sense to me. It kind of flies in the face of reality. It kind of ignores some basic human psychology as well, Take, for instance, the fossil fuel industry, right? There's evidence that a lot of these executives in these companies have funded research, and they knew about the climate change problem for a long time, and they've had time to turn their act around and try to get the word out or, improve the situation, but they haven't, because their main motivation is profit, right? Profit above everything else.
Well, you can surmise that just from their behavior. If the sales went down, if the profit went down, the stock price would go down. There goes their bonuses, there goes their retirement plans. That is the end of the world as they know it. And then if you want to get beyond that, we have this illusion that somehow market logic will solve absolutely everything, that it is the way that people get together and, quote, dialogue. Well, they don't. They're just transacting. And so take CO2 or carbon markets for an example. If you want to reduce the total amount of fuel, particularly fossil fuel that we use, you got to find a way to reduce the total fuel. If you can just buy credits on the carbon market, as a company, you can say, well, we don't need to do much. We can just buy our way out of this. It's all part of the market. And that somehow the logic of that market will cause us to compress our footprint. It's not working very well.
That's a pretty big loophole. I wonder how they missed something like that. It makes you wonder if maybe they didn't miss it. Maybe it's built in there so people can circumvent the rules, right?
Oh, I think the people that designed it are very well-meaning. It's the delusion that somehow market logic is the supreme logic that we have to go by. A part of that also is that sort of arm's length negotiating of a bunch of companies or parties that are really working their own self-interest, that if you do enough of that, it benefits everybody. And that's true to the extent if you're still expanding, if you can do that. Otherwise, it doesn't work very well. you wind up with some people having a lot more than others. And before the Industrial Revolution, just about every stable society had to have some mechanism to correct for that. And there is right now a great deal of criticism of the system from several different points of view. I don't think even the business community is really happy with it. And by conventional reasons, they will try to stabilize a couple of weaknesses. One of them is the problem you get into when there's excess evaluation of assets or capital. And that might be stock, it might be something else, but that's what gives you boom-bust cycles in a market.
What is a boom-bust cycle?
Oh, I can sort of see one coming on right now with hemp among farmers. All of a sudden, this looks like a hot new crop, so everybody's going to grow hemp. Then the price will bust and somebody will get out of it, or a bunch of people get out of it again. That's boom-bust. And something like that happened 25, 30 years ago with ostrich farming. Everybody's going to get rich. Ostrich farming didn't happen. So you had the big boom in ostriches, and then you had the big bust. The one that persists, though, is with real estate, some with commercial, and a lot with residential. And if you're in an area, housing prices, either rental housing, apartment buildings have gone way, way up, or individual residences, valuations have gone way, way up. They're a sad story you see every once in a while of somebody that's lived in the same house for 40 years, but the valuation went way, way up. They pay property taxes on it, and they got to where they can't even pay the property tax on a house they've lived in for a long time. Something's wrong with a system that lets things get that far out of balance. And so the legal minds and legislatures try to address it somewhat, but it's a chronic issue. And just part of the system.
And that's why we need to organize for learning, right? Because we need to find new systems, new economy, new government. There's a lot that needs to change.
Yeah, so you're really talking about a basic differences in social contracts and how we live. That's on a big scale. You can try to do that in maybe smaller communities with a more localized economy, small scale, and stay out of the way of this big ongoing behemoth and begin to get somewhere with it.
Yeah, and, I think if that's the approach, the train has to stop somewhere with the system as it currently is operating, right? And I think as the flaws start to become more evident to normal people, average people who aren't economists, they're going to catch on, right?
Oh, I think some of them are catching on. And that may be some of the reason right now for public protests in Puerto Rico, Hong Kong, France. May not put their finger on the problem, but underlying all that is there's something wrong with the system we're living by.
And, we need to stop waiting for some grand solution to materialize out of somewhere, right? We need to bring it down to the local level, communities, people talking about the issues, because we're not going to have like a Karl Marx figure write some, grand testimony of how the world should be, and then everybody just adopts that model and everything's all right again, right? The world's different, place to place, community to community.
Karl Marx was a unique guy. He was pretty good critiquing the weaknesses of the capitalist system. I doubt personally that he would have been at all satisfied with what the Soviet Union became. But that's a whole other thing. We need to get past these communist or socialist divides between that and capitalism and get compression thinking, asking, what is it that we really do? And now what do we need to do differently, regardless of what you call the system?
Yeah, we need to start thinking more broadly and less in black and white terms, right? Like another example of that, besides capitalist, socialist, is here in America, you're born, and then the momentum of history is pushing you forward. And in terms of politics, you're forced to make a decision, right? You're on the red team or the blue team, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat.
If you are thinking about being symbiotic with nature, those labels start to lose their meaning. Uh, as far as destroying natural resources, if you have a lot of energy that you can apply, either capitalist or socialist, you can do the same thing. Or indeed, the economic damage of the old Soviet Union was probably worse than it was in the United States.
So let's talk about dialogue. Let's say people listening to this podcast, they come together in their community and they start forming these learning organizations. There's some, stuff to keep in mind, right? Like the rules of dialogue, which we'll get into more in depth in the final episode of this series. But right off the top of my head, another example that we didn't get into there is the difference between dialogue versus debate. Like if you have a group of people and your goal is to really make meaningful progress in solving some of the issues we're up against, you need to be listening to each other, and you need to, debate doesn't get us anywhere, right? I mean, of course, debate has its uses, right? But coming at it from a more problem-solving mentality, I guess, is the goal, right?
Yeah, start with behavior for learning. If you can go into a meeting thinking that I am going to learn something from this, even if I'm just going to learn what makes somebody tick that I think is totally out of it, you've got a much better attitude. And that's what's necessary for a dialogue. First stage of a dialogue is coming together. Only one person speaks at a time. Other people listen to understand what their perspective of the situation or the problem is. If you can do that, you can kind of map out what a social mess you might have with something, or environmental one. If you're just come into it and you're going to debate, you got fixed positions, you'll sit and argue with each other, and later you can say, well, didn't Joe have a really zingy name to call somebody else? Doesn't get you anywhere.
Yeah, those petty tiffs, these historical disagreements that, certain individuals have with each other, certain groups, family, blood feuds, stuff like that happens all the time. But we can't change our past, but we can influence the future,
Yeah, and it's a very key part of compression thinking, and it's the big gamble. There is, I would say, the smart money would not bet that this would work, that we will never be able to change our behavior enough to make anything like this work in big numbers. One phrase for that, can we have an attitude of honest inquiry? That's the ideal of science. Go look at reality, gather evidence, let the chips fall where they may. The message is whatever the message is.
I think a key point to that is, you need to be mindful of your own biases, right? Confirmation bias is a huge issue, right? If you already have your mind made up about the answer, then all the studying you're doing isn't really productive.
It can be very misleading at best. Confirmation bias is a nice term for saying you're much more likely to see what you want to see than something you don't want to see. And a lot of accusations of that, for example, just in nutrition research, that so much of it is bought and paid for by food companies. And can you trust it? And it's well known that if you just look at the commercial interest or affiliations of the researchers involved, there's a clear difference in findings from a lot of them, depending upon how the study was sponsored or financed, and what financial interest some of the investigators may have had. And so, if you're just doing an experiment to confirm that, gee, we got the hottest product on the market, that's not honest inquiry. This is kind of akin to religion, because I was just looking at the infiltration of mindfulness for use by the corporate community. And mindfulness is, self-examination. It's derived from the Buddhist tradition mostly, and it's seeking the true way and learning to understand your own mind, etc. But as practiced in a corporation, what's the objective? Well, They mean well because the objective is for the employee to have a better work-life balance and maybe to be a little happier and content. But it does not change the direction of the company or what they're trying to do.
It's not true mindfulness if the goal is to, again, maximize profit, right?
Yeah, and you can say maximize profit in a very harsh way, or by this system, you may not be trying to maximize profit, but you don't want to be spectacular losing money. And then what needs to be done that we think is a big money loser? How would you do that? That's a good big teaser. Well, we got to do it. Well, everybody's got together to do it, and that's a very different kind of thinking from, we'll do it if we can figure out how everybody can make money doing it.
Well, what are some more habits and behaviors that kind of encourage learning that people should adopt?
Curiosity is one of those. There are people that are naturally curious, and there are others that are just have something else in mind. In fact, I had an experience as a young college student about that, on what made a researcher, and said that's somebody that just can't wait to get back to the lab in the morning and see what happened in the experiment. And they can be real smart about other things, but if they don't have that going for them, they're not truly going to be a researcher. That is a person that is willing to jump out and say, what is this? And is this different from what we've seen before? Instead, they will absorb an awful lot of facts and maybe be a great success operating by the system.
And speaking to all those curious minds listening to us right now, I want to shout out our teleconferences real quick, Doc. We really hope that all of you will, attend to speak with us so we can hear what you have to say about these issues, because only so much that we can know. So, Doc, for those curious minds and maybe for those not so curious minds as well, what is the essence of what we're trying to convey here?
Oh, let's say something like, it's the system, stupid. That's a takeoff on the political slogan of the 1990s, by the Clintons mostly, that you're going to win an election if you can keep the economy going, meaning the expansionary economy. And so that slogan was, it's the economy, stupid. And so if everybody's got a job, or if a lot of people have a job and they're making money, surely everything is okay. But this is more serious than that. And we still have a huge amount of thinking that if the system is working well and everybody's employed and everything is going okay with the system, we're doing okay. Think symbiotically, think what effect we're having on nature, and it starts to become apparent there's a huge flaw in that system. And that's what we have to get to individually and in small groups, and maybe eventually as a big chunk of humanity.
And that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed listening to this, please feel free to join us in our weekly teleconferences where we discuss the problems you and your community are facing while trying to think of possible solutions. The problems we're up against are way too large for any one person to tackle on their own. It takes all of us coming together. These dialogue sessions happen every Tuesday. You can participate by calling the number provided on our webpage. Times, topics, and the number to call are all found under the Compression Thinking Series tab on our website, www.compression.org. Also, please do not forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If we're going to make a dent in some of the issues we discussed today, it will take all of us coming together, and your support helps. I know it feels as if we've merely scratched the surface of this topic, so if you're interested in learning more, you can check out Doc's many papers, videos, and book reviews at the same website, www.compression.org. Thanks for listening, everyone.